Configuring websites. The main function of Internet Information Services is to allow you to publish websites that can be accessed either on the Internet or from an intranet. The World Wide Web or WWW service is the service that allows both static and dynamic content to be published to your target audience. Now, when we first installed IIS using the Manage Your Server wizard in the first video in this series, it automatically created a default website. So to view this website, we'll first open up the Internet Information Services MMC by clicking on Start, Administrative Tools, and then coming down here and launching Internet Information Services Manager. So we'll come over here to the left and we'll expand our server, and we'll expand websites, and you can see here the default website that was created when we installed IIS. Now this default website is, as you would expect, a website which is installed by default, which you can then use to build your own website or change it as you see fit. In IIS, websites are made up of files and applications stored in directories, much like your standard Windows file system. IIS uses two types of directories: home directories and virtual directories. Home directories are the central location where your published files are stored. The default home directory for IIS is located on your system drive, which is in most cases your C drive, in a directory called www-root, which is located in the inet pub directory. As simple as this gets, you can copy your web pages into this directory and they're ready to be accessed by your favorite internet browser. So to illustrate this, I'll just close this down here. We've got a file here called index.htm, and I'm just going to right click, select copy. I'm going to come down here and choose my computer. We'll go to our C drive, our inet pub directory, and then our www-root directory, and I'm just going to paste that file in here. Now if we go and fire up Internet Explorer, and we'll navigate to http:// and then we'll enter in server 01, which is the name of this server, and we'll hit enter. And now we can see IIS 6 simply finds our page and presents it to the user. Okay, now that's pretty easy. You can instantly see home directories in use. Now we can also nest directories within our home directory as well, exactly like you would with regular folders and subfolders on your operating system. So if we go back to Windows Explorer and we'll right click inside our www-root directory and we'll create a new folder, and I'm just going to call this one sub. Now what we've done is created a subdirectory within our home directory. Now if we go back to Internet Explorer and navigate to our server 01/sub and hit enter, you can see that we get an HTTP error 403, which is forbidden. Now the reason we get this HTTP 403 forbidden error is because IIS 6 doesn't have a default page to load, and we do not have directory browsing configured for this folder. So now if we go back to our www-root directory, we'll copy our index.htm file, we'll paste it into our subdirectory. This time we'll go back here and we'll hit refresh. And there we can see that the page loads, and that's because IIS 6 is pre-configured with 4 default named pages, and index.htm just happens to be one of them. Okay, so what happens if we go and rename our index page to something else? Well, let's try that. We'll go into our subdirectory and we'll just change our index.htm to index.html, and we'll say yes to the file extension change. We'll go back here again and we'll click refresh. And there we can see that our directory listing has been denied. So why was this denied? Well, IIS doesn't know anything about our new pages. So we've got two choices here, at least, to be able to get something up on our screen. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go back to Internet Information Services. We'll right click on our default website and we'll choose Properties. Now if we come here to our Home Directory tab, we could choose one option, which is to allow directory browsing. If we choose that and choose OK, we'll now come back here and hit refresh. Now we're presented with a crude Windows Explorer style listing of everything that's contained inside this directory. And here you can see that we have one single file, index.html. Now, we could explicitly define the URL by typing it into the browser. In this case, we'll just add in index.html and hit enter. And there we can see our page loads. But that's not really what we want to do. Why not just let IIS 6 know about the name of our new default page? Okay, so we'll go back to our IIS MMC and we'll come down here and we'll right click on our subdirectory and choose properties. Now we'll go and uncheck our directory browsing and come up here to the Documents tab. Now as you can see, our index.html file isn't listed as a default content page. So to add this in, we'll come over here and click on the Add button and we'll simply type in index.html and choose OK. And then we'll choose OK again. And now we'll come back here and I'll just remove the index.html from my URL and hit enter. Now what it's just done is shown us a directory listing again, and that's because it's likely to be cached. So what we'll do is we'll hit refresh, and there we can see our default page index.html has now been loaded. Now, a directory like we just created, our subdirectory underneath our www root directory, is one way of creating a website hierarchy. Another way is by using a virtual directory. Now it's important to understand, however, that a virtual directory doesn't have to be located underneath our home directory. No, not at all. So what is a virtual directory? A virtual directory is simply a directory that can be placed almost anywhere but appears to a user that it's directly part of the website path. So let's illustrate what I mean. So we'll come back to our IIS MMC, we'll right click on our default website and we'll select New Virtual Directory. And this starts up the virtual directory wizard. So the first thing we're going to have to do is give our virtual directory an alias, which is simply a name in which users will see that appears to be part of a subdirectory. So I'm just going to call this one virtual and then click next. Now we'll need to provide a path to our physical directory. Now this can be a UNC path pointing to a share on a different computer if you like, but I'll just create a new directory at the root of my C drive, which is obviously not within the path of my root home directory. So I'll click on the Browse button, I'll choose my local C drive. Now we know that under my inet pub, here's my www root directory, which is the root of my home directory for my IIS server, but I'm not going to create it there. I'm just going to create it here at the root of my C drive. I'll click Make New Folder, and I'm just going to call this folder Data and choose OK. And we can see that the C data has been put here into our path field. So I'll choose Next. And I'm just going to leave my access permissions to read and to be able to run scripts. I'll choose Next and now Finish. Okay, and here we can see that our virtual directory has been created, called virtual, yet it points to a folder called data that sits outside my root home directory. Now I'm going to go back here to my inet pub directory. I'm just going to go up here and right click on my index.html file, and I'm going to go back to my C drive and I'm going to paste that into my data directory. Okay, now let's go back to Internet Explorer and we'll enter in the path to the file. So this would be server01/virtual/index.htm and we'll hit enter. And then we can see again the page loads using this new path. So there you can see the power of virtual directories. Virtual directories are great because they appear as though they're a physical subdirectory, yet they can be practically anywhere, such as a share on a remote computer that provides the content. So back to our IIS MMC. If we now right click on our virtual directory and choose Properties, we can see that the path points to the data directory on our C drive. But we can also point our virtual directory to a share located on another computer, or even a totally separate URL if we want to redirect users to a different place or even a different website. Now if you would like the content to come from another computer, simply select a share located on another computer and enter in the UNC path to the content. So if my content was on server 02 in a share called Stuff, I'd simply enter in /server02/stuff. Now if this share requires special permissions to access it, click on the Connect As button, uncheck this box, and then enter in the username and password of a user account that has permissions to access the contents of that share. Now the default setting, uses the credentials of the current user to access the share. So check the permissions on the remote share to see if guests have the ability to read contents of the share if that's required. Now, of course, our other option was a redirection to another URL, either within the same website or to a different website. Now, we also have a few additional options here as well. If we choose the exact URL entered above, this option redirects the client to the URL listed here in the Redirect To box without modifying the URL. So if you decide to check this option, you will need to enter in a fully qualified URL into this box. Now that means we'd need to enter in something like www.testdomain.com/index.htm. Now, if we choose a directory below the URL entered, this will send the user to a subdirectory that lives inside the directory that the user entered into their browser. So if the user had typed in www.testdomain.com/stuff, and we'd enter into this box a subdirectory of /bits, they would be redirected to the bits subfolder. Now just make sure that if you do choose this option, you will need to type in a subfolder name and prefix it with a /. Now the last choice is for a permanent redirection to this resource, and you'd use this option when you're moving a site from one URL to another. This option sends the user's browser an HTTP 301 permanent redirect message, and this can be used by some browsers to automatically update their bookmarks, so now they'll point to the new location. Okay, we've talked about the basics of a website and directories and where to store content. So let's now go and take a closer look at the properties of our websites. So I'll click cancel here, and now we'll right click on our default website and we'll choose properties. Okay, now we have 8 tabs here to contend with. So let's start off at the default tab, the website tab. The first option we have here is to change the description of our website. Now this is just a display field in the IIS MMC. Now it won't be seen by the user, so you could change this to practically anything you like. Now next we have the IP address that we want to assign to this website. The default is to listen on all unassigned IP addresses, and that's fine if you only have a single network card in your server, or you want all network cards to be able to serve IIS traffic. But if you only want a specific network card to be able to send and receive data for this website, you can select another IP address from the drop-down box, or you can type it in manually. Now, if you do decide to type in an IP address manually, be careful because IIS doesn't check to see if it's valid or not. It just trusts you, so make sure you enter it incorrectly or your web server might be unavailable. Now the next thing we see here is the standard TCP port that this website will listen on, and that's port 80, but we can change that if we wish. Now just be sure if you do change this port that you don't have another application on this server that's already using the same port, or you're going to run into some problems. Now because the default TCP port is port 80, if we change this by entering a different number in altogether, say for example we use port 1521, now, instead of users simply typing in www.testdomain.com, they'll have to enter in www.testdomain.com followed by a colon and then the port number of 1512. Now that can be kind of messy, and it's not what web surfers normally expect to see. Similarly, we can enter in a port if you want to use Secure Sockets Layer or SSL. Now the default SSL port is 443, and like with our TCP port, if we enable this by entering in a different port altogether, again, let's assume that we use port 1521, instead of entering in https://www.testdomain.com, they'll now have to enter in testdomain.com followed by a colon and then the port 1512, and again, we could cause some confusion to the user. Now generally, I'd only suggest that if you're going to use a different port, you'd probably only do this on a website that you don't particularly want public to access, or you redirect them from your homepage to a URL that points to the correct site and port. Don't rely on the user to type this in. Okay, if we go and click on the Advanced button, here you can set multiple identities and have multiple addresses for this website. Now this is great because it enables you to have multiple IP addresses and a single website, or even a single IP address and multiple websites. If we click on Add, we can again select an IP address for our website to listen on. We could also choose the port, and we have something called a host header value. A host header enables us to have several websites all listening on the same IP address and to divert the user to the correct folder based on the URL that they've typed. Now I'm just going to go and cancel all this for a minute, and what we'll do is we'll go and create a couple of quick websites so we can illustrate what we mean, because we'll get to create host headers along the way. So I'm going to right click on websites and select new website, and this starts up the new website wizard. So we'll click next, and the first thing we'll need to do is enter in a description for the website. Now remember, users won't see this, so call it whatever you like. I'm just going to call this one Beach Balls and click next. Okay, now I can set the IP address and port, and I'm just going to leave these defaults at all unassigned and port 80. Now for the host header, let's say my Beach Balls website is registered as beachballs.com. So what I'll do is I'll enter in www.beachballs.com, and in fact I'll come back here and put that dot in there so I've spelled it correctly, and then I'll choose next. Now I'm going to need to enter in the path to where the content for my Beach Balls website is going to be stored. So I'm going to click on Browse, I'll select my C drive, I'm going to choose Make New Folder, I'm going to call this folder Beach Balls and choose OK. I'll choose Next, I'll leave the default permissions at Read and Run Scripts, choose Next, and now choose Finish. And there we can see our Beach Balls website has been created. Okay, so let's go and create another. I'm going to right click on websites again, choose New, Website, choose Next, put in a description for this one. Now I'm just going to call this website Sandpits. I'll choose Next. I'll leave the default at all unassigned for our IP addresses and our TCP port of port 80. Now in my host header for this one, I'm going to enter in www. Include the dot this time, sandpits.com, and choose Next. Now we need to enter in the path, or again I'm going to choose Browse, choose my C drive, choose Make New Folder. I'll enter in a path of Sandpits, choose OK, Next. I'll leave again the defaults at Read and Run Scripts, choose Next, and choose Finish. Alright, now we have two new websites. Now if I come over here on the left hand side of my MMC and click on websites, here you can see in the right hand side of our MMC the websites that we've configured. We've got our two new ones plus our default website. Now, when a user types into their browser www.sandpits.com, they'll resolve the DNS name to an IP address that just happens to be this machine. But as you can see, I've got two other sites other than our Sandpits sites also running on the same port over here. So which one wins? Well, that's where the host header comes into play. Under the HTTP 1.1 specification, which most newer browsers support, the header, which is sent in the packet to my web server here, contains the name of the host, hence the term host header. From this header, IIS determines where it should direct the user. So in this case, the user that entered in www.sandpits.com would be redirected to the Sandpits website we just created a moment ago. Conversely, if a user entered in www.beachballs.com into their browser, they'd come here to the Beach Balls website. Now the other information that we can see here is an identifier value for our website, and that's useful for identifying and manipulating our websites using scripts. We can see that the state of our websites are all running, and of course we can see the host header value if we have one configured, the IP address that our site's listing on, the TCP port, any SSL port, and any status information about our websites. Okay, well let's go back to the properties of our website. So I'm going to right click again on my default website and choose Properties. Okay, now under our Connections section, the default is to enable HTTP Keep Alives. Now an HTTP Keep Alive is for when the user's browser asks the server to keep a connection open for the client. Now because the connection remains open, the user's browser can ask for multiple things without having to re-establish a separate connection each time. Now when you consider a typical web page, normally it will contain text, images, possibly tables, frames, scripts that run, even dynamic content from other websites. Every separate piece of information results in another connection to the web server. So using keeper lives is a good idea that prevents those additional connections. So it's recommended that you do leave this box checked. Now, if the user's browser fails to close the open connection after it's finished with it, the connection will stay open indefinitely, taking up valuable server resources. So the connection timeout here of 120 seconds will force the connection to close. Now, the final thing on this window is to enable logging, and that's checked by default. Now, logging connections to your server is a good idea, and we recommend that you leave this box checked. Now, we have a whole video dedicated to the subject of logging, so we won't go any further into that here. Alright, the next tab we have up here is the Performance tab, and it's a pretty basic screen with only a couple of options that you can configure, but it's an important one as you can control the bandwidth and the number of connections to your websites. Now, like most people, I don't have an infinite amount of bandwidth to play with, and if I have several websites on my server, I don't want to have one site hogging all the bandwidth. So if we check this box to limit the amount of bandwidth that's available to this website, we can specify how much bandwidth in kilobytes that we'll allow to this website. The default selection is 1024 kilobytes or 1 megabyte per second of bandwidth, and you can change that as you see fit. Now, if you do decide to enable this feature of IIS, IIS will need to install the Windows Packet Scheduler, which is used to control bandwidth, and that will cause your network connection to be restarted. So bear that in mind if you have a particularly busy website. Even though your network connection will only be dropped for a few seconds, you might want to do this when you schedule downtime. Now, the other option we have here is to limit the amount of simultaneous connections that this website will accept. The default is unlimited, but if we check the Connections Limited To button, we can specify a number of connections from 0 to 2 billion. Now, any new connections after this limit's reached will be dropped and users will receive an error message. Okay, now the next tab we have here is the Appy Filters tab. Here's where we can specify Internet Server Application Programming Interface filters for this website. Now, if we specify a filter, then all HTTP traffic to this site will be directed to these Appy filters in the order that they're listed here in this window. So to add a new filter, we'd simply click on Add, enter in the filter name and a path to the Windows executable, and then click on OK. Now, next we have the Home Directory tab, and we've seen most of this before. Here we can specify where the content for our website is located, either in a folder on this machine, in a shared folder on a different machine, or we can redirect the user to another URL. Now, down here we have the permissions that are associated with IIS. Now, these permissions are a separate set of permissions and are not related to NTFS permissions. Instead, these permissions here are applied before any NTFS permissions on any files or any folders are even considered. Now, in our video on web server security, we go through these in much more detail, but for the sake of completeness, we'll do a 20-second run through here. Now, firstly, we have script source access. Now, if you check this box, this allows users to access the source code for your scripts. That's if the read or read and write permissions are also set. Now, you should almost never set this option because scripts are processed on the server and not the client, so there's no requirement for clients to be able to access your source code. Now, next we have the read permission, and it's perhaps rather obvious what this one does. It lets users read files. Now, if this box is not checked, then users can't view your website. Perhaps the only reason you might want to disable read access is if you want to temporarily stop people from viewing your site, or if you have a folder that has write access and you want to allow people to upload files to your server but not be able to read the files. Now, if you do enable write access, then your users do need a browser that supports the HTTP version 1.1 specification, which understands the put function in order to upload, or put if you like, files into the folder. Now, the next thing we have here is directory browsing, which displays the contents of the folder in a Windows Explorer style listing. Now, by default, we will happen to write to the IIS log files a record of all activity on this website, and if we have the indexing service installed, we can index the content to make searching faster. Now, here underneath Application Settings is where we can configure applications. configuring applications really serves the purpose of defining a boundary for your IIS applications. By defining several applications, each application can run separately from the others and uses its own worker processes to run its scripts, executables, and content, and so on. Now this effectively isolates it from your other websites. Now the benefit of this is that if you have an application that causes problems, this application, being isolated from the others, doesn't bring the other applications down. So here we simply enter in a name for our application. I'll just call this one Beach Balls. Now we can see the starting point for this application is our default website. If we click on the configuration button, we can set which ISAPI extensions we want to cache for this application, any options such as session states and script timeouts, and we can also configure ASP debugging options as well. Now I'm not going to go into this in detail as we've got a separate video which is dedicated to application pools. Now the next thing we have down here is our execute permissions drop-down box, and this specifies if scripts and executables are allowed to run on our website. Now we have three options here: none, which prevents any scripts from running; scripts only, which only allows scripts to run; and of course we have scripts and executables, which allows scripts and Windows binary executable files to run. Now if you don't have any scripts or executables that need to run on this website and there's only static content, then for best security, set this to none. Generally speaking, however, if you do need scripts or executables to run, then set them at the directory level as it's much more granular. Now finally we can see that this application belongs to the application pool called Default App Pool, and again this is the subject of our application pools video. Now the next tab we have here is the Documents tab. Now here's where we can specify a default document for our IIS6 directories. You see, when you type in www.somedomain.com, the first page that loads is the default document. Now IIS comes configured with a few default documents defined, but of course you can define your own. So if your home page is called default.htm, IIS will pick that up and display it. Now it does this in order, so if you happen to have a page called default.asp in your home directory as well as the default.htm file, then the default ASP page will never be displayed as it appears second in the list. The solution to this would be to select this default ASP page and click the Move Up button. Now, because the default ASP page appears above the default HTML page, the default ASP page would be loaded first. Okay, so what happens if your home page happens to be called start.php? Well, in that case, we'll just simply come over here, click on the Add button, type in start.php, and then click on OK. Now, because start.php has been added to the bottom of our list, if you've got any of these other pages residing inside your home directory, you'll either need to move start.php to the top, remove the other entries in this list by highlighting them and clicking on Remove, or simply removing the unnecessary pages from your physical home directory. Otherwise, start.php will never load. Now we also have the option of specifying a footer page which will be added to every page that's displayed in our website. Now this makes it easy to maintain a single footer page rather than having to update every page on your site if you need to add or remove an item that normally appears at the bottom of your web pages. So if we select Enable Document Footer and then click on the Browse button, we can simply locate the footer page that we wish to display, then click on OK, and we're done. Now every page in our website will have this footer page added to the bottom of our page. Okay, now the next tab we have up the top here is the Directory Security tab. Now the first option here we have is to configure authentication. And this is where we can specify how users are identified and authorized to view our website. Now I'm going to skip this because we've got a whole video dedicated to authentication, and I'm also going to skip the next section of granting or denying access based on IP, subnet or domain name, as this is covered in our web server security video. Now down the bottom here, we can configure IIS to use certificates to secure communications between our IIS server and the clients. Now certificates are a rather complex subject, and it's outside the scope of our discussions in this video, and it will be discussed in detail in a later video in this series. Okay, now our next tab is the HTTP Headers tab. Now, in addition to creating additional HTTP headers, you can configure when content should expire, the content ratings, and the MIME types. Now, if we choose to enable content expiration, we can control how long browsers will cache our content for. When content is requested by a browser, the expiration date is also passed along as well. And this is useful, for example, let's say you have a special offer that appears on your homepage, but it's only valid for the next 2 weeks. Well, you can set the content to expire after 2 weeks, and that forces users to receive an updated version of your page so that they aren't looking at old cached content. Now, if you are using ASP pages, you can code this into your pages and set the response object with the expires or cache control property to expire content. But for largely static objects like images, you'll need to configure that right here. So the first option we have is to expire immediately. Now, this setting tells the browser not to cache the data at all, and this is most useful when your site has a page with dynamically changing content, such as scripts that dynamically build your page. Now, this means that each time the user browses to your site, they will get a fresh page each and every time, and you can be sure that it's not being cached at all. Now, expire after allows you to set an expiration period in minutes, hours, or days, and you can choose any value between 1 minute and 32,767 days, which equates to about 90 years. Now, the last setting to expire on will set the content to expire at a specific time and date of your choosing. Now, the only clause being that you must choose an expiration date of today or later. You cannot choose a date that occurs in the past. So in other words, I can't set it to expire yesterday. Just be aware that the expiration date is processed by the client, and that means that it will be affected by the client's time zone. So there might be some variation in exactly when the content is expired, depending on where the client is located. Okay, next we can add custom HTTP headers if you like. Now, generally you probably won't make much use of this feature, but it's used to add information to the header that IIS normally sends to the client's browser. So to add in a header, we'd simply click on Add and type in the custom header name and the custom header value, and then click on OK. Now, you can modify any custom headers by simply selecting these from this list and then clicking on the Edit button, or you can delete them by clicking on the Remove button. Just be aware that you won't be prompted if you select to remove one. It'll just go ahead and delete it. So be mindful of accidentally choosing this option. Okay, next we can specify content ratings for our content. Now, content ratings are a voluntary system that's controlled by the ICRA, or Internet Content Rating Association. The ICRA is a non-profit organisation that aims to rate content to help parents decide what their children can access as far as internet content goes. Now, this content rating actually has two sides to it: the server side that we control and the browser side, which is controlled by your web browser and can be used to block certain sites based on ratings content. Now, if you're using Internet Explorer, simply click on your Tools menu and select Options, and then your Content tab, and you can set the browser ratings there. So if we click on Edit Ratings and then check the Enable Ratings for this content box, we can set what type of data is on our site. So for example, if our website contained offensive language and we dropped the S word a few times, now we could come down here and select Language and say we might move this slider bar, say across to 2, indicating that we've got a few moderate expletives on our site. But if we happen to drop the F word every second breath, well, that would probably be a candidate for cranking the bar all the way to the far right, and that would warn people up front that we're perhaps a little devoid of finding other ways to express ourselves, and their browser, in conjunction with our server settings, can make the determination whether or not that the page will load or be blocked. Now at the bottom here, we can add in an email address of the person who has rated this content. So normally that would probably be your webmaster or perhaps a manager of your company. And we can also set an expiration date for our content rating anywhere from today up until December 2035. Okay, the last thing we have on this window here is the MIME types, and we won't go into that as we do discuss MIME types in our web server security video. Okay, on to our final tab, which is our Custom Errors tab. Now, when a user surfs your website and encounters an error, generally these errors aren't really all that informative, such as when, say, a user receives a 404 error or page not found error. It'd be much nicer for the user to have a nice page telling them that this page wasn't found and perhaps offering a search feature or tips on where they should be looking or something like that, rather than just a dead-end page. So let's take this page not found error or 404 error as an example. Instead of the user receiving this boring static page, if we come down here and choose the edit button, we can see that in the event of a user receiving a 404 error, this user will simply be presented with a file which is stored in this location. Now, it's simply a matter of producing a nice friendly page, browsing to that location where you have it stored, and then clicking on OK. And now the user, when they have a 404 error, will be redirected to your nice friendly page. Now, you can also redirect them to another URL in the event that this error occurs, or you could simply redirect them to the default error page. Now, on the subject of this default error page, if you want a quick way of setting one of these error pages to be a default error page, you could simply select Set to Default button, and it's done. So that just saves you a couple of clicks from having to go in there. Okay, well that's all the properties of a website. Now I'm just going to cancel this now, because what we'll do is we'll right click on our default website again, and we'll take a look at some of the other options that we have here. Now, firstly, we can choose to explore or open the website. Choosing Explore simply displays the contents of the website in the right-hand pane of our MMC, whilst choosing Open opens up Windows Explorer to the path where we have the website configured. So here we can see it defaults to our home directory, which is our inetpub www root directory. Okay, if we go and right-click again on our default website, we could see that we can also look at the permissions that are associated with our home directory and modify those as we wish. Now, if we choose Browse, Browse will open up our default web page. Now note here again, we can also start, stop, and pause our website as well. Now, the only difference between stop and pause is that when a website is stopped, all requests, including those that are currently in progress, will be aborted and any new requests are denied. Now, pausing a website does deny any new requests, but requests that are currently being processed will be honoured until they're complete. So pausing a website is a nice way of letting users finish their requests before cutting them off. Now, on the new flyout menu, we can choose to create a new website or a new website from a file. Now, if we choose New Website, it simply starts up the New Website wizard, which we've seen before. But New Website from a file lets us create a new website if we've already saved a configuration first. So if we come over here and select the All Tasks menu, we can see that we have an option of saving a configuration file. If we select this, we're prompted for a file name, a path where we want to save the configuration file, and whether or not we want to encrypt our information using a password. Now, once we've saved a configuration file, we can then come back in here, choose New, and then create a new website from a file, and then import our saved configuration file, and we can start a new website with all the settings that we've already configured. And this can really make building additional sites that require similar settings much quicker. Now, finally, we can create a virtual directory and a virtual directory from a file, and we've also looked at those options here. Now, our other options here are to delete a website, rename it, and of course, refresh this screen. Okay, well, that's the properties and options for an individual website. Now, don't forget, these settings that we've discussed only are applying to this website and no others. If we want to configure settings that cover every single website on this server, we can come up here and right click on websites, then select properties. Now, all of these tabs you'll notice are identical to what we've just seen, so I won't go through all of them again, but we do have a new tab up here, the Service tab. Now, on this Service tab, we can configure IIS to run the www service in IIS 5 isolation mode. Now, IIS 5 isolation mode is built into IIS 6, and it's there to provide backwards compatibility with applications that don't work with worker process isolation. Now, if you decide to enable IIS isolation mode, then you will lose all of the new functionality that you get in IIS 6, and that's true for all websites on your server. So if you have a specific application that really needs to run using IIS 5 isolation, then perhaps consider putting it on its own server if you can, as that way the rest of your sites can still take advantage of the benefits of IIS 6. Now next we can enable HTTP compression, which enables IIS to compress application files as well as static files. Now if you do enable HTTP compression, you can specify the directory where the files will be stored. And you can see that the default path is listed here under our Windows IIS temporary compressed files directory. Now if HTTP compression is enabled, then the compression will occur on the server and the compressed content is then sent to the client. Once the client receives the compressed content, it's uncompressed by the browser and then displayed as normal. Now if you like, you can specify a maximum size that we will allow this temporary directory to grow to. Now by default, the default is unlimited, but you can certainly change it if you like. Now given the amount of content that most companies have and the low cost of disk space, the default setting will be okay in the majority of cases. Now if you do happen to specify a maximum value here and this directory fills up, IIS will begin removing files as it requires more space by deleting the old stuff first. Okay, that's websites. Even though IIS supports FTP, newsgroups and SMTP, in the overwhelming majority of cases you'll be using it for websites. With IIS 6, the reliability, scalability and functionality has been improved a great deal, and even third-party statistics are showing that this new version has made IIS a real heavy-duty competitor to other web servers out there that run on competing operating systems. So give IIS 6 a go if you haven't already. I'm sure that you'll find the improvements are enough to make you consider moving your sites to Windows.